1918. Britain stood victorious at the end of World War I. The fighting had stopped. The enemy had surrendered. Europe was exhausted. But Britain's biggest problem was not on the battlefield anymore. It was on the balance sheet. The war had been won with borrowed money, emergency finance, and promises pushed into the future. And those promises did not end with the armistice. While crowds celebrated victory, Britain quietly inherited something far more dangerous than defeat. A mountain of obligations it could not simply erase. No parade could pay interest. No medal could settle debt. No peace treaty could undo 4 years of financial strain. The war ended in 1918. Britain's payments were only beginning, and what followed was not collapse overnight, but a slow financial weakening that reshaped the country for decades. At the time, almost no one saw it coming, and its consequences would soon reach every part. After the war ended, Britain didn't immediately feel like a country in trouble. In fact, it felt like the opposite. The fighting was over. Soldiers were returning home. Trade routes were reopening. From the outside, Britain still looked like a global power that had survived the worst conflict in history. So there was a natural assumption, almost an emotional one, that things would slowly return to normal. Winning, after all, is supposed to fix problems. The government believed that victory itself would stabilize the economy. Businesses expected demand to recover. Ordinary people believed the sacrifices of the war years would finally pay off. The war had been expensive, yes, but it was treated like a temporary shock rather than a permanent wound. What almost no one stopped to think about was how the war had actually been financed. Because wars don't end financially when the shooting stops. They end when the bills are settled. And Britain hadn't settled anything yet. It had simply postponed the cost. What looked like recovery on the surface was actually the beginning of a much harder phase, one shaped not by battles but by numbers, obligations, and decisions made under pressure during the war itself. World War I wasn't just expensive, it was financially exhausting in a way Britain had never experienced before. This wasn't a short conflict where costs could be absorbed and forgotten. For 4 straight years, Britain had to keep an entire global system running under extreme pressure. Millions of soldiers had to be fed, clothed, transported, and armed. Ships had to move constantly across oceans. Factories were pushed to their limits, producing weapons and supplies without pause, and none of this slowed down. Every single day the war continued, money was being burned just to keep things from collapsing. Britain wasn't choosing between good and bad financial decisions anymore. It was choosing between spending more or losing the war outright. What made it worse was that Britain wasn't only paying for itself, it was supporting allies, protecting global trade routes, and holding together an empire that stretched across continents. The war forced Britain to operate as if money was infinite, even though it clearly wasn't. By the time the fighting finally stopped, Britain hadn't just spent a lot of money, it had reshaped its entire economy around emergency financing. Normal rules were suspended, borrowing became routine, long-term consequences were pushed aside. The war had trained Britain to survive without asking one critical question. What happens when the spending can't stop? But the war does. When the war began, Britain didn't have a long-term financial plan. It didn't sit down and calculate what 4 years of global conflict would actually cost. There wasn't time for that. From the very beginning, the goal was simple: keep the war effort alive at any cost. So Britain did what countries always do in moments of desperation. It started borrowing. At first, borrowing felt manageable. The war was expected to be short. Money could be raised now and dealt with later. But as months turned into years, borrowing stopped being a temporary solution and became the backbone of the entire war economy. Taxes were raised, of course. Income taxes expanded. New duties were introduced. But taxes alone could never keep up with the scale of spending the war demanded. Every increase helped, but it barely slowed the bleeding. So Britain went further. It began selling overseas investments, assets that had taken decades to build. Railways, businesses, financial holdings abroad were quietly liquidated to keep money flowing back home. These were not strategic decisions made in calm conditions. They were emergency moves, made to survive another month, another battle, another shipment of supplies. By the later years of the war, Britain's finances were no longer operating under normal rules. Borrowing had become routine. Long-term consequences were ignored because the present moment felt more urgent. And, as domestic options ran thin, Britain increasingly relied on one external source of money, one that would permanently change its place in the global financial order. Before the war, Britain didn't just have money, it decided where money moved. London was where global finance passed through. When governments needed capital, they came to Britain. That position gave Britain quiet control over trade, influence, and global decisions. World War I changed that relationship without anyone announcing it. By the later years of the war, Britain found itself depending on American credit to keep essential supplies moving, not because Britain had collapsed, but because its usual financial tools no longer worked fast enough. American loans filled the gap. At first, this felt harmless. The United States was an ally, not a rival. Borrowing was framed as cooperation, but dependence worked silently. Every shipment that relied on American credit reduced Britain's ability to act independently. The important change wasn't the amount borrowed. It was who had leverage. Britain could still fight. But it no longer set the financial terms of that fight. That shift didn't feel dramatic in 1917 or 1918. There was no crisis headline. But once the war ended, Britain discovered that financial leadership doesn't return automatically, especially when repayment schedules, currency stability, and post-war planning now depended on someone else's balance sheet. When the war finally ended in 1918, Britain believed the hardest part was over. The fighting had stopped. Emergency decisions were no longer necessary. What remained, many assumed, was simply the task of returning to normal. There was confidence that time itself would solve the problem. German reparations were expected to cover a large part of the financial burden. Global trade, once disrupted by war, was supposed to restart and generate growth. Britain's economy, after a short adjustment period, was expected to regain its balance. In this mindset, wartime borrowing was treated as a temporary inconvenience rather than a structural problem. This belief shaped Britain's post-war decisions. Instead of rethinking its financial position from scratch, Britain tried to restore the world it remembered from before 1914. The goal wasn't adaptation, it was restoration. Stability mattered more than flexibility. Appearances mattered more than adjustment. And what Britain failed to recognize was that the war had permanently altered the financial landscape. The conditions that had allowed Britain to dominate global finance before the war no longer existed. Markets had shifted. Power had shifted. Obligations had hardened into long-term constraints. Britain wasn't making reckless choices in the years after the war. It was making optimistic ones, based on the assumption that victory would eventually correct the imbalance. That assumption quietly guided the next major decisions Britain would take, decisions meant to project strength, but which would end up tightening the financial pressure even further. After the war, Britain didn't want to look like a country in decline. It wanted to look normal again, strong, stable, in control. And in the early 1920s, one decision seemed to promise exactly that. Britain decided to return to the gold standard. Before the war, the pound had been tied to gold. That system symbolized financial discipline and global trust. Returning to it was seen as a way to signal that Britain was back to stability, back to leadership, back to its old position in the world economy. On the surface, the logic made sense. A strong currency would restore confidence. International investors would trust Britain again. London could reclaim its role as a global financial center. This wasn't framed as a risky move. It was framed as a correction, a return to normality after years of chaos. But the economy Britain was trying to restore no longer existed. During the war, prices had risen, industries had changed, and Britain's competitive position had weakened. Fixing the pound to gold at its pre-war value made British exports more expensive and domestic businesses less competitive. What looked like financial strength on paper translated into pressure inside the economy. Unemployment rose, growth slowed, industries struggled to adjust. Britain wasn't making this decision recklessly. It was making it deliberately, believing that discipline would solve the problem. But discipline applied at the wrong moment can deepen strain instead of relieving it. By choosing appearance over flexibility, Britain locked itself into a system that left little room to breathe, especially while war debts and financial obligations still loomed in the background. Once Britain locked itself into this path, the pressure didn't arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, year after year, in ways that were easy to underestimate. The war was over, but the payments continued. Interest had to be serviced. Loans taken during the conflict didn't disappear simply because peace had returned. Budgets that were supposed to support rebuilding were instead tied up managing obligations from a war that had already passed into history. Every financial decision Britain made in the 1920s carried the weight of commitments formed under emergency conditions. What made this especially damaging was how invisible it felt at first. There was no single moment when Britain could point and say, "This is where things went wrong." Instead, the strain showed up quietly. Growth remained weak. Public spending became constrained. Social pressure increased as governments struggled to balance responsibility with reality. The debt limited choices. Money that could have modernized industry or eased economic transitions was diverted toward maintaining credibility and meeting repayments. Britain wasn't collapsing, it was stagnating. And stagnation is harder to recognize than crisis. As the years passed, it became clear that the war had created obligations that outlived the generation that fought it. Financial flexibility, the ability to respond quickly to new challenges, had been sacrificed long ago. Britain was now operating within narrow margins, constantly adjusting, constantly managing, but rarely moving forward. This wasn't the result of one bad decision. It was the cumulative effect of choices made under pressure, locked in by policy, and sustained by the belief that endurance itself was a form of strength. And over time, that belief began to reshape what Britain could realistically afford to be. Britain didn't wake up one day and realize it had lost its place in the world. There was no announcement, no single crisis that marked the moment. The change happened gradually, almost quietly, as financial pressure shaped what Britain could and could not do. Before the war, Britain had been the reference point. Its currency mattered. Its financial decisions echoed across global markets. Other countries adjusted themselves around Britain's position. After the war, that role slowly faded. Britain was still powerful on paper. It still had an empire. It still had influence. But financially, it was no longer setting the pace. Decisions were increasingly defensive rather than ambitious. Stability became the priority, not expansion. Managing obligations mattered more than taking risks. At the same time, another country was moving into the space Britain once occupied. Capital flowed differently. Trade routes adjusted. Financial leadership didn't disappear, it shifted. And once that shift began, it was difficult to reverse. This wasn't a story of sudden collapse. It was a story of reduced options. Britain could still act, but only within limits shaped by past commitments. The future was approached carefully, constrained by the need to preserve credibility and avoid further strain. Winning the war had protected Britain's survival, but it had altered the balance that once allowed it to lead. Power, it turned out, wasn't lost on the battlefield. It was redistributed through finance, over time, without spectacle. And that pattern, where victory preserves the present but reshapes the future, would not remain unique to Britain. What happened to Britain wasn't unique to one country or one moment in history. It was an example of a pattern that tends to repeat whenever nations are pushed into extreme situations. Large crises, especially wars, force governments to prioritize survival over structure. Decisions are made quickly, costs are postponed, long-term consequences are acknowledged but rarely confronted in real time. At the moment, these choices feel justified, even unavoidable. The problem is not the decision itself. It's the assumption that everything can be reset afterward. Financial systems don't reset cleanly. Obligations carry forward. Power relationships shift. What feels temporary during a crisis often becomes permanent once the crisis ends. By the time this is understood, the options available are already narrower than before. History shows that the real impact of major conflicts is rarely felt when they happen. It appears later, embedded in budgets, currencies, and policy limits that quietly shape what governments can do next. Britain's experience revealed something uncomfortable, that winning preserves existence, but it doesn't guarantee freedom of action afterward. And once financial flexibility is lost, it doesn't announce its absence. It simply stops being available when it's most needed. That idea matters far beyond one country or one century, especially when looking at how modern crises are financed and managed today. Britain's story doesn't end with collapse or recovery. It ends with something quieter than that. The country continued. Life moved on. Governments changed. New challenges replaced old ones. On the surface, history marched forward as it always does. But underneath, the financial consequences of the war remained part of Britain's reality for generations. What makes this story uncomfortable isn't that Britain made foolish choices. It's that many of those choices felt reasonable at the time. They were made under pressure, justified by urgency, and defended as necessary for survival. No single decision looked disastrous in isolation. The damage wasn't immediate, it was cumulative. Winning the war preserved Britain's place in the moment, but it reshaped what the future could look like. Not through defeat, but through obligations that quietly narrowed options year after year. Power didn't vanish. It thinned. And that is what makes financial consequences so difficult to recognize in real time. They don't arrive with drama. They arrive as limits. On spending, on flexibility, on ambition. Long after the celebrations fade, those limits are what remain.